Hello. I'm honored to be here tonight, and I thank everybody for joining us. And I have the honor and privilege of introducing Kristie Puckett Williams. And she is an amazing woman. She is the only person I know who has had a flag flown over the North Carolina General Assembly in her honor. And this was on Monday. And one of her passions is working for incarcerated women, in particular pregnant women. And this was as a result of her work on that issue. Kristie is also the manager for the Smart Justice campaign for the ACLU of North Carolina. And she's a working scholar on mass incarceration with a focus on the treatment of women. Kristie has actively participated and protested with jail support, an organization that was formed in response to George Floyd and the protests here in Charlotte. And she also serves as the chair of Women Incarceration Work Group for the State Reentry Council Collaborative. It's my privilege to introduce you to the one and only Kristie.
Thank you so much, Jenzy, and thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm just going to go ahead and get started with my testimony. According to the United States Department of Justice, an estimated 1 in 3 adults in the United States has a criminal record, and I am one of those adults. When I was 21 years old, I began a relationship with someone who eventually became violent and abusive towards me. To cope with the trauma, I began using cocaine and eventually started smoking crack cocaine. And to support my habit, I began engaging in illegal activities such as credit card and check fraud, stealing, making fake IDs, selling drugs. However, the first time I was ever arrested was for domestic violence, even though I was clearly the victim. The officer had been to my house many times, and he arrested me because he had told me previously that he came out to my house again, I would be the one arrested because he was tired of coming to my house every week. As a young Black woman, I learned very quickly that those who were supposed to protect and serve me did not always have an interest in doing so. Over the years, I was severely injured on multiple occasions, but did not seek out any assistance from law enforcement or the criminal legal system. I had learned from my prior experiences that my life wasn't as valuable as others' lives. My reasoning was validated time and time again during my struggles with the substance use disorder and through my experience with behavioral health and the criminal legal systems. One day, while on a particularly long drug binge, I saw myself on the news as a missing person. I had not been in contact with my mother for several days, and because of the abusive relationship she knew I was in, she reported me missing, fearing that my abuser had finally killed me. When the police located me, they did not seem happy that I was alive. Instead, they scolded me, telling me how many man hours they had spent trying to locate me, and that I had wasted resources that could have gone to people who really needed their help. They then handcuffed me and took me to a mental health facility where I was involuntarily committed for 10 days until I could see the judge who granted me my freedom. The psychiatrist who committed me treated me like a prisoner rather than a patient. He didn't ask any questions about me, my history, or my circumstances. He didn't treat me. He didn't even treat my symptoms. He simply told me he was going to do his job, which was make sure I wasn't suicidal, and then I would be released. I was released with the recommendation to attend NA meetings. I received no substance abuse counseling or treatment. I received no individual therapy to process the trauma. I got out and repeated the same vicious cycle. And eventually I found myself in yet another institution, but this time it was the jail. On the day that the police raided the house I was living in, I was charged with trafficking cocaine due to the amount of crack found in the home, 28 grams or 1 ounce. And my bond was set at $167,000. Once I was processed, I got to the pod where I was assigned. There was a white girl I knew from my previous incarcerations, and I had seen her in the street many times. And so I just said to her, "What you in here for now?" And she responded that she had been arrested because officers had found 36 ounces or a kilo of heroin. Her bond was $5,000. At the time, I couldn't understand why someone who had 36 times the amount of drugs I had was given a bond significantly lower than mine. And I later learned that this disparity wasn't because crack was more dangerous than heroin, but simply because crack was viewed as a Black person's drug and heroin was something mostly white people abused. During that same period of incarceration, I was pregnant with twins, which is classified as a high-risk pregnancy. I was in jail for months and received no prenatal care. I never had an ultrasound and never saw a doctor. When I went to court, I was shackled at both my hands and my feet, which put me at risk for falling. Eventually, I was sentenced. I took a plea and was sentenced. And one of the officers, an officer who had arrested me on many occasions, ended up actually being the saving grace, ironically. I didn't really recognize him because I've been arrested a lot of times and had a lot of contact with law enforcement, but he did remember me. And he told the judge, he also told my public defender and the district attorney that I needed help. I did not need to be incarcerated. I had a drug problem stemming from the years of abuse I had suffered. That officer advocated for me to have treatment and long-term support. And that is when things began to shift for me. I entered a 10-month program that included substance abuse treatment, life skills training, and trauma-focused care, along with the parenting classes to help me with my newborn babies. I was treated with kindness, compassion, and empathy in that program. I decided that I wanted to go to school. I earned an associate's, bachelor's, and master's degree, all in human services. And today I'm an advocate and activist in my community. My life changed because one person within the criminal legal system saw the value in me. One person stepped outside of his job description and asked for mercy on my behalf. When you encounter someone like me, a person of color with a mental health and substance use disorder who has repeated contact with the legal system, will you see the value of that person, or will you see a problem that needs to be disappeared? Will you listen to the person and treat them like the expert of their life, or will you make plans for them based on what you believe to be best? People, especially the most marginalized and disenfranchised, need to feel heard and validated. As a Black woman, that didn't happen to me until that day in the courtroom with that police officer back in 2009. I was closest to the problem, therefore I was closest to the solution, but I was farthest from the resources and the power. Will you make the resources and power readily available to those you serve? Thank you.
It is indeed a pleasure to pose questions to the amazing Kristie Puckett Williams. And thank you so much, Kristie, for sharing your story with us. So I want to start with asking, how has your experiences with the criminal legal system informed your views on what is required to transform the system?
Well, James, as I stated in my testimony, I was incarcerated multiple times as a response to my addiction to the crack cocaine. And instead of being offered treatment, I was caged. And so I was disappeared, but the social, political, and economic issues that I suffered from were not. And so they would just put on pause while I sat in the cage, waiting to be addressed when I come out. So that deep, intimate knowledge of how the system works and how it intersects with other systems to create hierarchical structures and barriers that block the public safety we say we want to have as a community, it has influenced the way that I see the criminal legal system.
And you spent your time, the time that you were incarcerated was in Charlotte-Mecklenburg?
Yes.
And so do you have thoughts on what needs to be done differently in Charlotte-Mecklenburg to help ensure a system that is fair and equitable to all?
Well, number one, we need lots of transparency. And I feel like we need to use a mix of data and the lived experience of impacted communities to imagine a system that works for all. Right now, we have people who are making decisions who don't have the life experience necessary to measure the impact. We know that oftentimes they have good intent, but they do nothing to measure the impact of those decisions and the policies that they put into place. So I would say we need a mixture of data and more impacted communities driving the work in Charlotte-Mecklenburg.
In your opinion, why do we continue to witness more police executions like Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Andrew Brown, and on and on and on?
Well, as someone who spent the last 20 days in Elizabeth City, dealing with the aftermath of the death of Andrew Brown, I think the issue is the essence of the police power is the discretion to use violence. They have the ability to decide whether or not to use violence in any conceivable situation. The reasons for even the most basic police interaction, the stop, have never been clear. You can be stopped for walking too fast, walking too slow, being stationary. All of those are grounds for a stop and have always been used unfairly and unequally. The courts have always refused to define discretion because to define discretion would be to limit the police. And discretion, James, isn't just about individual decision-making. It's also organizational and institutional. The courts have consistently refused to provide any predetermined restrictions on what police can't do in any situation. They won't even tell cops that they can't drop a bomb on a building as they did in Philly in 1985, or use a robot to kill someone with a bomb as they did in Dallas in 2016. They won't limit police discretion because you can never tell police ahead of time what is reasonable or necessary, since all situations are always and forever unpredictable. And also, police do not enforce the law and aren't accountable to it. They handle the law after the fact to justify the way that they decided to restore order. And so for this reason, the law or police procedure won't stop police violence in any meaningful way. They deal with threats. In theory, Andrew Brown had rights under the law to be served the arrest and search warrants, but the deputies saw him as a threat. The law allowed the deputies to murder him in cold blood. Even if the law or courts find them guilty, those officers guilty, the law still allowed them to have the discretion to take Mr. Brown's life in the first place. It's a tyranny built into what Mark Nucleus calls the permissive structure of law. This means that law will never hold police accountable because the police are meant neither to be accountable to or to enforce the law. And so the solutions to that, in my opinion, is number one, we need to get rid of qualified immunity. We also need to have a public database of officers accused of and found to have used excessive force. What we know happens is an officer is fired from one jurisdiction, goes to another one, and works and engages in the same harmful behaviors because there is no system of checks and balances to ensure that the folks being hired are the bad apples that they always refer to.
And the centering of the lives of people most impacted by the criminal justice system, people who have been incarcerated, who have whose lives have been impacted by the pernicious aspects of the system. We hear that is important if we're going to transform this system, that their voices be centered. Could you tell us briefly why you think that is important?
Because again, we have that deep, intimate knowledge, not just of the prison or the criminal legal system, but we also have the knowledge of the ways that that system intersects with every other system and interacts with every other system. And so when you look at the criminal legal system, a person who has experience in the criminal legal system, they also have experience in the education system because they've been disenfranchised and disconnected from that system. They've been disenfranchised and disconnected from the healthcare system, from the public benefit system, from voting. I mean, disconnected and disenfranchised in every aspect of their life. And so they have a very deep, intimate knowledge, not just of this system, but they're also able to forecast and foreshadow the changes, the impacts that the policies and structures that we put into place, how those things may play out.
Well, thank you so much. Obviously, we could carry this conversation on, but we've got to give up the mic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I would just like to say thank you so very much, Kristie, for sharing your story with us. I've got a lot of notes and things that will go into our recommendations and next steps. And I just want to thank you for sharing your story with us. You are truly one of my sheroes. And I'm grateful for the work you do for all of us to make our community safer. And your dedication to creating sustainable change. So I thank you for sharing your fabulous story with us tonight. And with that, I guess we'll move on to our next impacted witness. Thank you.